I have this sudden urge to grow my hair out and do a mullet all over again. So, actually not. There are certain things you can't unsee, and Brandon Schaefer with a mullet would not be one of those things you would want to see. So, anyway, I love that. Love the safety dance thing on there. That was pretty cool, like fifth grade all over again. Those colors, those are so 80s, and I'll be honest with you, I think I had a jacket that pretty much had all of those colors going on all at the same time. It was the coolest thing ever. So, talking about Love Week a little bit, we're going to be talking about that over the coming weeks, but I'm excited to be able to do the single mom oil change again. And if you have questions about that, Tara's here, and she would love to talk with you today. She's already talked to several people about various projects that are going to be going on. So, there is a commercial. The commercial is actually from Farmers Insurance, and their tagline for the kind of that commercial series that they're doing is "We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two." Basically, what they're saying is their experience has allowed them to gain insight and wisdom into that particular area, so therefore, go ahead and buy your insurance from them. Now, I'm going to say that there's something that comes with age, there's something that comes with maturity and experience, and there's actually an individual in my life that he personifies for me the idea of I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And it's specifically in the realm of ministry. And because of that, I value this man's insight and words into my life. It was actually around the 1st of November in 2001. Tara and I and our 3 kids at that point in time had been New Mexicans officially 2 days. And we heard the doorbell ring, and my immediate thought was, it's a neighbor introducing themselves. But I didn't realize that we don't do that here in New Mexico, especially the East Mountains. So went to the door, and there was a tall, slender gentleman with glasses, and he introduced himself as Errol Stepp. And Errol came in, and if you don't know, Errol is the founding pastor of Valley View. And he came in and sat in our living room, and we talked for 45 minutes or so, and he prayed with us, and then went on his way. And I want to let you know that that was the beginning of something that to me is very special, because Errol is a man who knows a thing or two about church and knows a thing or two about ministry, because over 60 years he's seen a thing or two. And he has great insight into the church. And to be honest with you, for the last 20 years or so, as I've been your pastor, Errol's been mine. He's a man who has prayed for my family, has been available. He has encouraged us, and I will tell you, he is the biggest cheerleader of Valley View Christian Church that there is. And so I value his voice, and one of the reasons why I value his voice is he did the hard work. Back in 1987, when he planted Valley View, and there were those moments where you could count the number of people in church on both hands, he put in the hard work. Also, I will say this, he loves the church. And I'm going to say not just that he loves this church, he loves the church, the global church. In fact, I will let you know that there was an opportunity I had to visit Errol in the hospital and pray with him. And as I prayed for his health, when I finished, Errol prayed, and he prayed not for his health, he prayed for the church and for the kingdom. That says a lot about him. And I also think that after 60 years of ministry and church planting, this guy has seen a lot. He knows a thing or two about the church. He knows a thing or two about ministry because he's been doing it for so very, very long. It's interesting to me that at one point in time, Errol was actually the youth minister at First Christian Church in Dodge City, Kansas. Talk about the Valley View Circle of Life. Let's just call it that. My son is the youth pastor at the exact same church in Dodge City, Kansas today. And there are people there today who still remember Errol's ministry. What an incredible thing. He knows a thing or two because he's seen a thing or two. But there's another pastor I want to talk about today who could say the exact same thing. You see, we're in this series. We're calling the series One Hit Wonders. Actually, we're playing off a bunch of the One Hit Wonder songs and so on. I want Our House in the Middle of the Street next week. That's the one. Y'all remember that? But one of the things is true, the Bible, that there are long books and there are short books, and there are actually 4 in the New Testament that are only 1 chapter long. So last week we looked at Philemon. Today we're in 2 John. And 2 John is written by the Apostle John, wrote 1 John, wrote the Gospel of John, also wrote 3 John, we'll be in next week, and the book of Revelation. Now, with that in mind, most scholars put the date of 2 John either 85 to 95 AD, somewhere in that range. So if you look at this is 55 to 60 years after the resurrection. So John walked with Jesus as one of his followers while he was here on this earth. As he walked, he was witness to the resurrection. He was there on the first day of the church. He had seen just the church blossom and grow from this small group of people in Jerusalem to pretty much a worldwide phenomenon by the time John had died. And so John as well is one of those who could say, I know a thing or two about church, and I know a thing or two about what it means to follow Jesus, because I've seen a thing or two. I've experienced a lot of this. And so he wrote 1 John, and I'm going to call 1 John his hellfire and brimstone sermon. He lowers the boom. He just lets them have it. And in a lot of ways, I read 1 John, and I just feel like a horrible person. It's like, am I saved? I just don't know if I am. Because John lets the church have it. Now, 2 John, written afterwards, a little bit softer. In fact, quite a bit softer. Right? It's one of those things that we might say it's a short letter. He's just, maybe he's trying to calm the waters a little bit, yet he gives them some very sound advice and instruction, and it comes out of the heart of a pastor. So let's go ahead and look at verses 1 through 4 of 2 John, and that's page 1025 in the Bibles that are in the seats in front of you. It says this, the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth. And not only I, but also all who know the truth, because the truth that abides in us and will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. So usually when an apostle, a church leader, would write a letter to the church, they would identify themselves. Like, I, Paul, I, John, I, James. We're going to talk about this in a couple weeks. I was actually telling Jim, I've already kind of studied for the book of Jude, and I am so stoked because I've never preached Jude, haven't preached 2 John either, but I'm excited about this. But Jude identifies himself. John here says, the elder. And it's interesting that the word that he uses for elder, there's actually 2 or 3 different words that are used somewhat interchangeably or for specific reasons of elder in the New Testament. And one of those words, in fact, the word that is used here is presbyteros. And presbyteros, where we get the word Presbyterian, and that idea of overseer and one who directs the affairs of the church. But I'm going to tell you the literal definition of presbyteros is gray hair. And the idea here is, if he's basically saying the gray-haired one, someone with gray hair was expected to have wisdom and discernment and knowledge that they could pass along. And eventually it became an office within the church, and one who directed the affairs of the church, one who oversaw and protected the church. But I remember one of my professors who used to say, this is like spiritual gray hair. That you have this wisdom from this idea of your age and your experience that comes into this. And so one of the reasons we maybe ask the question, why did he refer to himself as elder and not apostle? I think one of the reasons is John had settled into what is modern-day Turkey, and he had basically become an overseer of a lot of house churches in various little communities. So he's taking that role. In fact, we looked at, in the first part of the year, the 7 churches of Revelation. Maybe John was over all of those particular churches and the house churches in those cities. But with that in mind, I think there could be some codified language here. Some have even suggested that John is already in exile on the island of Patmos, and he keeps getting information about what is happening in the churches. So he says the elder, which they would understand this is John. He didn't have to identify himself. But then he says the elect lady. Interesting that the noun ecclesia, the noun church, is a feminine noun. So by referring to the lady, he is referring to the church, and referring to children, he's talking about those who call on the name of Jesus. So there's this kind of this codified language, but there's something else in this, what we would oftentimes call an introduction. This is just kind of an introductory statement, and it would be real easy for us to read over this until you realize that in the first 4 verses of 2 John, truth is mentioned 5 times. Now, in Bible study terms, this is a clue. This is a clue that John is lasering in on the idea of truth. You see, he is speaking as their pastor. He is speaking as this guy who had been to their funerals, been to weddings, been around when babies were being born, been through tough times, been through baptisms with many of these people. They had shared life experience, but he's coming as the gray-haired one, the one who has experience, the one who is able to speak into their life situation, and it's clear that they're struggling in the idea and area of truth. Now, if you're John and you're the pastor of this collection of house churches, I'm sure they've read 1 John. I'm also certain that they've read the book of John, which is the biography of Jesus' life. And ultimately, John is writing this so that they will believe in the real and the literal Jesus, where he says, listen, in the beginning, he was coexistent, co-eternal, and co-equal with God the Father. And this coexistent, co-equal, co-eternal Son, he literally became flesh. And the idea here is he abided here. He lived here. He dwelled in this earth. And so what was happening in the church, we're going to talk about this here in a few moments, but there were a lot of people in the church that were falling victim to a teaching that was saying Jesus never really became a man. Now today we kind of go the opposite and say Jesus was man but not God. And they were saying, no, Jesus was all spiritual but not flesh at all. And so what we find is that he is lasering in and really kind of admonishing the church to adhere to truth. And I would say it like this, and I think he's getting at this, and he's really kind of lasering in on who is truth, because Jesus, it says he is the way, the truth, and the life. The idea that he is truth here, that's truth personified. I'll say it like this: who Jesus is a non-negotiable for the Christian. Listen, I know that could sound dogmatic, and that could sound even almost legalistic, but the reality is this is one thing. I grew up with a statement that I heard in my home church a lot. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. And in all things, love. But the thing that I think we have to understand, there are certain things that are non-negotiable. And the fact that Jesus was born of a virgin, the fact that he lived a sinless life, the fact that he died on the cross and resurrected on the third day, that after he was resurrected, he appeared to people, and after he appeared to people, he ascended into heaven, and as he has ascended now into heaven, he is coming back again. These are what we would consider non-negotiables, and what he is encouraging the church to do is not just kind of intellectually acknowledge truth, but dwell in truth. And the idea of dwell in truth is we live in the reality of that truth, and it's a driving force in our lives. And so, again, he's taking that 60 years ministry of all the experience that he has had, and he is pouring into people, and he is pleading with them to dwell and abide in the truth who is Jesus, and to continue to walk in that truth. But notice verse 3. Verse 3 says, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Father's Son, in truth and love. So, as much as there was a passion for people to walk in truth, there is also the desire for people to walk in love. Let's look at verses 5 and 6. He says, and now I ask you, dear lady, again, church, not as though I were writing you as a new commandment, but one that we had from the very beginning. He is hearkening back to the book of John, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is, again, all of these commandments, but this is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. That's the pattern of life that we are in. When it talks about walk, it's the life pattern that a Christian has. Now, one of my top 5 favorite preachers, I wouldn't probably say he's my favorite preacher, but one of my top 5 favorite preachers that I like to watch is a man by the name of Andy Stanley. So some of you may have heard of Charles Stanley. That might be more of your generation. It'd be his son. He's got this ginormous church in Atlanta. And a few years ago, he wrote a book called Irresistible, where he kind of looked at the history of the early church. And in looking at the history of the early church, he said, what was it that made it so irresistible? And there was a lot of things that he kind of pinpointed, but one of them was the way the church loved. The way they loved one another, and the way that they loved people around them. And actually, Jesus reiterated that. There in Mark chapter 12, there's an example where religious leaders come to Jesus. And I always imagine religious leaders coming to Jesus with like this swagger, this pride, this, we're going to get him this time. And so this religious leader comes to Jesus and says, hey, what's the greatest commandment? And it says, Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important, love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. And I think a lot of times we look at the order here, and we think order of importance is that we love God first, and then we love our neighbor. Andy Stanley, I think, points out, in fact, it says this in verse 31, it says that it's equal in importance. The idea here is it's not second in sequence, it's second in sequence, but not second in importance. And so the idea here is, as we love God, we also love our neighbor. That the two things go hand in hand, and that is what we do. So Jesus actually modeled this. Jesus actually modeled this, and I think about John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, it says that Jesus was prepared to show them, his disciples, prior to the Last Supper, the full extent of his love. And it says what he did is he took off his outer cloak, basically in his underwear, wrapped a towel around him, and he washed his disciples' feet. Now, as far as a servant, Jesus' stud factor is immense here. And let me tell you why I think this is so incredible, is that I think, this is just personal opinion, we can disagree, but listen, I think feet are gross. I always have. I think feet are the grossest thing on the face of the planet. In fact, I'll just tell you, my wife, she's like she's like a baby whisperer. She is great with little babies and so on, was with our kids, is with our grandkids. I love that this week we get to go see our grandkids. But she would always do this thing, is like she was changing them into their pajamas and so on, take off their socks, and they got these sweaty feet. My wife would actually like smooch and, kiss on their feet, and they would giggle and so on like that. And I'm thinking, she kisses me. That's gross. No, I actually kid. But the thing about this is, feet are kind of grimy. And we don't get that in our culture today as much, because if our feet get a little dirty, we can just go home and take a shower. But feet can get pretty grimy. In fact, I remember we used to play baseball, and my mom hated it when we went down to, there were 3 communities, Protection, Coldwater, and Ashland, and all of them had red dirt. And so that red dirt and that clay and everything, it was just nasty, get her socks all nasty. And I actually thinking about when we were doing the landscaping the other day. I wore tennis shoes because that's how I roll and so on. But I got home, and I'll be honest with you, my feet were just caked and grimy. But that is nowhere near to what feet would have been in the day and age of Jesus. See, they didn't have sidewalks like we got today. They didn't have like the paving system like we have today. Also, their mode of transportation were not vehicles. It was a different kind of horsepower. And oftentimes they would have to walk behind the horses. And so what was on their feet was not always just dirt. And so if you were a servant, and your job is to wash people's feet, I'm going to share something with you. It doesn't get any lower than that. It's kind of like, well, you flunked that, and you flunked that, and you flunked that. Here's all we got for you. And so when you think about Jesus doing that, Jesus really kind of flips everything upside down. He even goes on to say this, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. By this, people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Let me share an example with you. It's kind of a facetious example, but it's one of the best examples that I can think of in my feeble mind. I grew up in the church, and one of the things about growing up in the church in the 70s and 80s, and I'm sure every church in Christendom has gone through a period where this is part of the reality of church, it's the potluck dinner after church. Y'all remember those? Okay, potluck dinner after church. And so here's how potluck dinner happened at my church, and probably every single church in the history of history. You say amen at the end of the service, the final song is done, and every preteen boy rushes to the church basement. They grab the napkin that is wrapping the knife and the fork, and they jockey for position to get into the front of the line. And so as the ladies are bringing out the fried chicken, and as they're bringing out the green Jell-O, and they're bringing out the brownies, and they're bringing out Beanie Weenies. Y'all remember Beanie Weenies? I can't remember the last time I had it. If you don't know what that is, it's baked beans with hot dogs cut up in it. But when you're 8 and you're 10, this is the best thing on the face of the planet. And so all the boys are lined up, and they are just like, we just have to be first, and we just have to have all of this, with no regard to the fact that our potluck gluttony is going to leave mere crumbs for the little old ladies who are standing in the back of the line. Well, you know what happened? Nearly every single one, we were standing there. It's like you'd think we would have learned our lesson. You know, the preacher would get up and say, all right, we're going to have a prayer, and brother such and such is going to have a prayer. Boys, back of the line. It's kind of funny. But when it comes to church, we have this thing called flesh. We have this thing called sin. And it makes us selfish. And loving people is not always the easiest thing to do. And sometimes in the church, we demand prominence, and we want to be first. And we jockey for position, and we seek recognition, and we want leadership. And we get what we want, and not even realizing it, we're excluding people in the process. This is what Andy Stanley says is love. Love means you're racing to the back of the line, not the front. That true love is saying, no, you first. No, you first. Ever been at the intersection when you both get there first, and you're doing that thing with your hands, like, and they're doing that thing, and you just kind of go back and forth? What if the church were that way? What if that's where we could end up? And so let me just share something that's on my heart. In fact, it's on my heart a lot. And I'll just give you the full spectrum of things. Back in 97, 98, I think it was 1998, our church in Missouri helped start a church in the northland of Kansas City, which, you know, anything about Kansas City, it'd be Gladstone and that area of Kansas City. And we had actually, the guy who came in to start the church is kind of from that particular area, but he had started a church in New Hampshire. And he was coming kind of home to start a church in the Kansas City area. Well, with that, I had a conversation with him, and I was like, well, how's the church different and so on? I don't know if you're aware of this, but churches, for the most part, are tax-exempt organizations. And one of the reasons behind that is the government feels that the good a church does in the community far outweighs the tax revenue that they're going to get from it. And so that's why they offer the tax-exempt status. But he was telling me about New Hampshire, where you have churches that are 200 and 300 years old, and the communities view the church as a drain because they only care about themselves, they keep to themselves, and they really do nothing in the community except occupy expensive real estate. And I remember that conversation. I remember thinking, that's not what God has called the church to be, and so on. And so I'll be honest with you. About 18, 19 years ago here, myself and the elders, we read a book. After reading the book, we began to ask a question that was posed in this particular book. And the question that we framed it is, if Valley View were to suddenly shut its doors and leave the community, would the community weep? Would they even know? And let's just be honest, this is not church bashing here. But in many places and in many churches, they could shut the doors and the vast majority of people in the community wouldn't even know. And so that's kind of what has really driven a lot of the stuff we do in the church, outside the church. We talk about Love Week, and this is a shameless plug. If you really want to know what gets me up in the morning, what gets me excited, I like what we do in here. Jim and I have talked about if sermons are going to share the world, or if sermons are going to change the world, it would have already been done by now. I told my wife the other day, it's not that I don't want to do Sundays, but again, if Sundays were going to change culture, it would have already been done by now. Maybe the call is for the church, for what we do in here, to matter out there. Maybe, just maybe, the fact that we could go and love the unlovely and love the forgotten is maybe something that we need to do. And so I'll just go ahead and frame it this way. If the truth we talk about in here doesn't compel us to love each other, to love our neighbors, to love our community, something's off. And I think John's getting that. Like, listen, you can be in truth, but if it's not in tandem with love, something is off. So we are compelled not just to walk in truth, but walk in love. Now, after John kind of talks about this, kind of changes gears. Notice verses 7 through 11. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. What do you think about that? That's what we're talking about, those who do not believe Jesus actually came in the flesh. That was the false teaching that was happening. And John finishes, such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you may not lose what we have worked for, but win a full reward. Notice the idea of watch yourselves. Everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. This is John. Now, there's a lot of different opinions out there, but John's saying don't forsake what you had to follow some teaching that will lead you nowhere. And then he goes on, verse 10. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. So hospitality was an ethic and a value in the early church. John is saying, listen, as these visiting teachers go along, if they don't pass the Jesus test, don't associate with them. Don't take the chance that they're going to maybe lead you astray. Essentially, what he is saying is do not be deceived. And again, he's speaking as a pastor. He's speaking as a pastor who, he was there on the first day of the church, and we read in the book of Acts that he and Peter were preaching, they were arrested, they were beaten, they were flogged, and they were told, you can preach whatever you want to preach, just don't preach the resurrection. To preach Jesus without the resurrection is false teaching. And so we find that he's seen a thing or two. He remembers the time that legalism crept its way into the church. He remembers the time where polytheism was coming into the church. Now he's talking about a time where they're saying, well, Jesus, the Jesus you're talking about, that's not the real Jesus. And so there was false teaching coming into the church. And folks, I think we need to really kind of open our eyes in our day and age and understand that as much as Satan was deceptive 1,900 years ago, he's deceptive now. And there's deceptive teaching going on all around us. And we could spend a whole long time talking about this, and we could talk about the cultural norms that I'm actually working through a book right now called Live Not by Lies. And one of the things is talking about in our culture in America today, it says the heresy of heresies. In other words, the false teaching of false teaching. From the cultural standpoint, this is the false teaching, is that the biggest false teaching is common sense. Wrap your mind around that for a moment. That science doesn't matter, history doesn't matter. It just matters that I can live my truth. It's a dangerous place for us to be. Because my truth is seldom, if ever, connected to the truth, who is Jesus. So with that in mind, I think about the verse 12 here. Just read this with me. Though I have much to write to you, I'd rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come to you and talk face to face so that our joy may be complete. Again, this is Pastor John talking to his church. I got a lot more to say, but I've said what I need to say, and what he said was enough. And if I could sum up what John said, it's this right here. We, as Christ followers, must walk in truth and love while guarding ourselves from deception. We continue to walk in tandem with the truth of Jesus and the love for people, the truth of Jesus and the love of people, but also understanding Satan will do everything he can to stop us. He will do everything he can to deceive us in every way. So I've got a couple of questions here today. As we think about how to own this, and think about the questions that we can ask ourselves, maybe the question is this: where in my life do I need to race to the back of the line? Where in my life am I trying to be first? Where in my life am I trying to be most important? Where in my life am I demanding my rights and my way, my recognition? And so that's that flesh thing, that sin thing growing in us that is constantly at battle saying, put me first. So where in your life? Hey, you might be good in a lot of areas, but there might be some blind spots that you may need to ask Jesus to say, did Jesus reveal to me my blind spots? Where am I racing to the front instead of racing to the back? Here's another question. Where in my life am I being deceived? Again, where's a blind spot? I grew up, we've been having some 80s sort of things. Grew up in the 70s and 80s. I remember watching the movie, so I'm going to go ahead and say this. Where in my life am I drinking the Kool-Aid? Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. If not, Google Jim Jones and Kool-Aid. You'll know. Where in my life am I being deceived? Folks, we had an election this week. Again, it was a primary election. It's a midterm election. We say, no big deal. How many of us, whether we're Democrat, Independent, Republican, Libertarian, whatever it may be, have the thought, if we could just get our guy, then everything's going to be good? Also, ask this question. Where do I need to be more rooted in the truth? I used to live in West Texas. Some of the best barbecue on the planet. They use mesquite. And if you ever had a chainsaw and tried to run through a log of mesquite, it's hard. It'll dull your chainsaw quicker than anything. And this is one of the reasons why they say it is such a hardy wood that if the tree is 20 foot high, it's 40 foot deep. So in other words, the deeper the roots, the stronger the tree. What do I need to do to be more rooted in Jesus? Join me in prayer. Father in heaven, thank you. Father, I thank you for your Son and his word, and I thank you for your servant, John, who challenged the church in truth, in love, in fighting deception. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.